There is a kind of bravery that makes no sound. It does not roar like thunder or announce itself with drums. It simply exists, quietly, like the roots of an ancient tree holding the earth together long after the storm has passed. Imagine yourself standing alone in the middle of a vast open plain, wind pressing against your chest, no shelter in sight, knowing that everything you love is behind you and everything uncertain lies ahead. That is the space where silent courage lives. For the Native American warriors of history, courage was not always the war cry. It was the stillness before it. It was the warrior who sat with his elders through the long night, listening, absorbing, carrying the weight of his people's future without letting it break his posture. It was the mother who wrapped her children in animal skins and kept walking through snow when her legs had every reason to stop. Courage, in its truest form, has always been quiet. Why is that, do you think? Why is it that the loudest acts of bravery are celebrated while the silent ones are so easily forgotten? Perhaps because silence does not ask for recognition, and that in itself is a profound kind of strength. The warriors we are about to explore across these stories were not simply fighters, they were philosophers of endurance. They understood that every battle was not only fought with weapons, but with resolve, with identity, with the unspoken decision to remain fully human in the face of forces that sought to erase them. Before we meet each of them, let us honour the quiet. Let us honour the courage that never made the history books, but held entire civilizations together. That silence is not empty. It is full of everything they chose to protect. Picture yourself as a child, watching the stars from the top of a hill, feeling as though the sky is not above you, but all around you. You are part of it. That sense of belonging, of being woven into something larger than yourself, was not a feeling for Crazy Horse. It was a truth he lived by every single day. Born somewhere around 1840 along the Rapid Creek in what is now South Dakota, Crazy Horse of the Oglala Lakota was never a warrior who sought fame. In fact, he avoided it almost deliberately. He rarely allowed himself to be photographed. He did not collect trophies. He led by presence, not performance. What made him extraordinary was precisely what made him difficult to describe. He was a man of visions. As a young boy, he experienced a powerful dream in which a rider moved through storms untouched, protected by the spirit world. That vision shaped him. He rode into battle without war paint, often alone, always at the front, and almost never suffered a wound. At the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, Crazy Horse coordinated one of the most tactically brilliant engagements in the history of the American West. General George Custer and more than 260 soldiers were defeated, not by chaos, but by disciplined, intelligent strategy driven by a man who understood the land like his own heartbeat. And yet, victory was brief. Within a year, cold and starvation had broken what bullets could not. He surrendered in May of 1877, not from defeat of spirit, but to save his starving people. He was killed just months later, bayoneted while in custody. His last words reportedly were simple. He said he had hoped it would not have to come to this. That sentence carries the weight of 1,000 unfinished conversations between two worlds. Suppose you found yourself in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico, surrounded by heat and dust and silence so complete you could hear your own pulse. The rocks offer no shade, the trail offers no mercy, and behind you, an entire army of thousands is following just one man. That man is Geronimo. Born in 1829 to the Bedonkohe band of the Apache, Geronimo was not a chief by title. He was something harder to define. He was a force. His Apache name was Goya, meaning one who yawns, but there was nothing sleepy about the life he lived. The name Geronimo came from Mexican soldiers who reportedly cried out to St. Jerome during his raids, and somehow that name became the word the world would remember him by forever. His resistance was born from personal tragedy. In 1851, Mexican soldiers massacred his wife, his mother, and his 3 children while he was away trading. Something in him shifted that day, not broke, shifted. He became a man with nothing to lose and everything to fight for, and that combination made him almost impossible to stop. For decades, Geronimo led raids across Arizona, New Mexico, and deep into Mexico, evading thousands of United States and Mexican troops with a band that sometimes numbered fewer than 40 people. 40 people. Against thousands. And they held on. His final surrender in September of 1886 to General Nelson Miles marked the end of the Apache Wars and the last significant armed resistance by a Native American leader in the American Southwest. He was never allowed to return to his homeland. He died in 1909 at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, a prisoner of war until his final breath. He once said he wanted to die in the mountains. The mountains were not permitted. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine being asked to give up everything. Not some things, everything. Your land, your language, your way of calling to the morning. What would remain of you if all of that were taken away? What part of you would refuse to disappear? For Sitting Bull, the answer was all of him. Every single part. Born around 1831 near the Grand River in present-day South Dakota, Sitting Bull, or Tatanka-Iatake in Lakota, was both a warrior and a holy man, a combination that made him uniquely powerful among the Hunkpapa Lakota Sioux. He did not separate the spiritual from the strategic. To him, they were the same conversation. Long before the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, Sitting Bull held a Sundance ceremony and received a vision of soldiers falling like grasshoppers from the sky. He shared that vision with his people. Days later, Custer's forces were defeated. When prophecy and outcome align that precisely, it does something to a community's faith. It solidifies it. But Sitting Bull's power was not only in battle. It was in his refusal to bend to the story others wanted to tell about his people. When he was brought to perform in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in the 1880s, audiences expected a defeated man. What they got was someone who moved through those performances with dignity so enormous it confused them. He was killed on December 15, 1890, by tribal police during an attempt to arrest him, just days before the Wounded Knee massacre. He died as he had lived, refusing to make himself smaller so that others could feel comfortable. There is a lesson in that kind of wholeness that the modern world is still trying to learn. What if you were placed in a situation where every path forward led to loss, and yet you still had to choose one? Where the only options were bad and worse, and your people, your elderly, your children, were watching your face for a reason to keep moving. That was the geography of Chief Joseph's life. Born in 1840 in the Wallowa Valley of present-day Oregon, Chief Joseph, whose Nez Perce name was Hinmatuyalatkekt, meaning thunder rolling down the mountain, inherited leadership of the Wallowa Band at a moment of absolute crisis. The United States government was demanding the Nez Perce abandon their ancestral homeland and move to a reservation in Idaho. When tensions broke into violence in 1877, Chief Joseph made a decision that still echoes through history. He led approximately 700 of his people, including women, elders, and children, on a retreat of more than 1,400 miles across the mountains of Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, trying to reach Canada and safety. For nearly 4 months, they outmaneuvered, outthought, and outlasted United States Army forces in a series of engagements that military historians have studied for generations. They were not warriors in the traditional image. They were a people trying to survive. They were stopped just 40 miles from the Canadian border in the Bear Paw Mountains of Montana in October of 1877. Chief Joseph's surrender speech is one of the most quietly devastating documents in American history. He said that from where the sun then stood, he would fight no more forever. Not I give up. Not we lost. He would fight no more forever. That phrasing carries in it the full weight of exhaustion, dignity, and grief pressed into a single, unforgettable sentence. Consider what it would be like if you were in a room with people who had decided you were guilty before you spoke a word. Your reputation had travelled faster than your voice, and now every gesture you made was interpreted as threat. How would you carry yourself in that room? Cochise of the Chiricahua Apache carried himself like the mountains he called home. Unmoved, patient, and when pushed beyond patience, devastating. Born around 1810 in what is now southeastern Arizona, Cochise rose to lead the Chiricahua Apache during one of the most turbulent periods in the history of the American Southwest. For much of the 1850s, relations between his band and American settlers and military were tense but manageable. Cochise had actually worked cooperatively with the Butterfield Overland Mail, allowing them safe passage through his territory. Then came 1861. A young, inexperienced lieutenant named George Bascom accused Cochise of raiding a settler's ranch and kidnapping a child. Cochise had nothing to do with it. He came to the meeting tent voluntarily to clear his name. Bascom attempted to arrest him. Cochise escaped by cutting through the tent canvas with a knife, but several of his family members were taken hostage. What followed is known as the Bascom Affair, and it set off more than a decade of fierce conflict between the Apache and the United States military. Cochise became one of the most effective guerrilla commanders in the history of North America. His knowledge of the terrain was so precise that entire military campaigns simply could not find him. He negotiated peace in 1872 under terms he found acceptable, returned to his homeland, and died there in 1874. He had asked only for what was already his. The misunderstanding that denied him that request cost thousands of lives. Imagine a single thread being pulled through the eye of a needle, but instead of thread, it is the fate of dozens of nations, and instead of a needle, it is history itself. One wrong move, and everything unravels. That was the task Tecumseh set for himself, and he almost pulled it off. Born around 1768 in present-day Ohio, Tecumseh of the Shawnee was perhaps the most visionary political mind produced by any Native American nation during the 18th and 19th centuries. He was not simply a warrior, he was an architect of unity. His dream was breathtaking in its ambition. He believed that the only way to resist the expansion of American settlement was for all native nations to stand together as one confederacy, not trading partners, not occasional allies. One unified political and military force that would hold a boundary line and say, simply, this far and no further. He travelled thousands of miles. He spoke to nations who had been enemies for generations. He argued with passion and logic and vision, saying the land does not belong to any one tribe. It belongs to all of them together, or it belongs to no one. His brother, known as the Prophet, provided the spiritual foundation. Tecumseh provided the strategy. The dream began to collapse at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, when his brother made a premature military move while Tecumseh was away seeking alliances in the south. Tecumseh allied with the British in the War of 1812 and was killed at the Battle of the Thames in October of 1813. He died before his dream could live. But the dream itself has never fully disappeared. The idea that unity is the only answer to division still echoes wherever people refuse to be conquered. What if the one time you won, winning still felt like losing? What if you fought a war, negotiated the peace, and watched the terms dissolve like morning fog? Red Cloud of the Oglala Lakota knew that particular kind of victory and that particular kind of grief. Born in 1822 near the forks of the Platte River in present-day Nebraska, Red Cloud or Mapialelta became the only Native American leader to win a war against the United States government and force it to abandon its military forts. Between 1866 and 1868, Red Cloud waged a relentless campaign against United States expansion along the Bozeman Trail, which cut directly through Lakota hunting grounds in Wyoming and Montana. His most devastating strike came in December of 1866, when Captain William Fetterman led 80 soldiers into an ambush that left none of them alive. The United States, facing military embarrassment and logistical impossibility, signed the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. The forts were abandoned. The Bozeman Trail was closed. Red Cloud had won. He then put down his weapons and never fought again, a decision that earned him criticism from some of his own people. But Red Cloud understood something crucial. He knew that warfare over time could only end one way. He chose to fight with words and negotiations in the halls of power, even travelling to Washington and New York City to argue for his people's rights. He was often manipulated, misled, and outmaneuvered in those halls. But he never stopped showing up. He died in 1909, having spent more than 4 decades trying to honour a peace that the other side never fully intended to keep. Sometimes the longest battles are fought sitting down. Visualize being in a scenario where everything that was promised has been taken back. The agreement made is now paper, and the paper means nothing. The trading relationships, the alliances, the careful balance of coexistence, all of it simply revoked, not by war, but by policy, by a piece of paper signed far away by people who have never looked you in the eye. That is what Pontiac faced in 1763. Pontiac was a leader of the Ottawa Nation, born around 1720 in the Great Lakes region. He had been a critical ally of the French during their long rivalry with the British in North America. The French had maintained relationships with indigenous nations built on trade and mutual respect. When France was defeated in the 7 Years' War and ceded its North American territories to Britain in 1763, that world ended overnight. The British immediately changed the rules. They restricted trade, withheld supplies, and treated native nations not as allies, but as conquered peoples. Pontiac understood exactly what this shift meant. In the spring of 1763, he launched one of the most coordinated multi-tribal military campaigns in the history of North America. Warriors from more than a dozen nations struck simultaneously at British forts stretching from the Great Lakes to Virginia. Within weeks, 8 of 12 British forts had fallen. The British were stunned. Nothing in their playbook had prepared them for this scale of coordination. Detroit held out under siege for months. Pontiac could not take it, and eventually the coalition began to fragment. A peace was negotiated, but the deeper wound was never healed. Pontiac was assassinated in 1769 by a member of the Peoria tribe, reportedly bribed by British traders. He did not live to see how prophetic his warning had been. Suppose you found yourself watching, helplessly, as strangers moved into your home. Not violently at first, just gradually, one room at a time. And the law, the very law that was supposed to protect agreements, kept finding ways to validate each new intrusion. Black Hawk watched this happen to the Sauk homeland for decades. Born in 1767 along the Rock River in present-day Illinois, Black Hawk, or Makataimishe was a warrior and war leader of the Sauk and Fox nations. He had fought alongside the British in the War of 1812, a decision rooted in his belief that British alliances offered more protection for his people than American expansion ever would. He was not wrong. By 1830, the pressure had become unbearable. A treaty had been signed in 1804 that ceded Sauk lands east of the Mississippi, a treaty Black Hawk maintained was fraudulent, signed by men who had no authority to sign it. He refused to recognize it. In the spring of 1832, Black Hawk led a group of about 1,000 Sauk, Fox, and Kickapoo, men, women, and children back across the Mississippi into Illinois, hoping to reclaim their land and plant crops. He carried a British flag, still believing it held diplomatic meaning. It did not. The United States military and Illinois militia mobilized immediately. What followed was a campaign of pursuit and massacre that ended at the Battle of Bad Axe in August of 1832, where hundreds of men, women and children were killed as they tried to cross the Mississippi River back to safety. Black Hawk was captured and later taken on a tour of American cities, paraded before crowds. He died in 1838 in Iowa, near the river that had once been the boundary of everything he loved. What if you were told that the only choice available to you was submission? That the question of whether you stayed on your land, raised your children in your language, or continued breathing the air your grandparents breathed had already been decided by someone else? Osceola's answer to that offer was silence, and then a knife driven into a treaty document. Born around 1804, Osceola was of mixed Creek and possibly European descent and grew up among the Seminole people of Florida. He was not a hereditary chief. He earned every inch of his influence through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance. When the United States government passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830 and began pressing Seminole leaders to sign the Treaty of Payne's Landing, which would relocate the Seminole to Oklahoma, Osceola reportedly drew his knife and plunged it into the document laid before him on the table. That gesture became legendary. It was the declaration of a war that would last 7 years. The Second Seminole War, from 1835 to 1842, was the longest and most expensive Native American conflict in United States history. The Seminole, fighting in the swamps and marshes of Florida that they knew intimately and their pursuers did not, made every military advance brutally costly. Osceola was finally captured in 1837, not in battle, but under a flag of truce. He had come to negotiate. He was seized instead. He was imprisoned at Fort Moultrie in South Carolina, where he died in January of 1838, just months after his capture. He was 33 years old. The swamps of Florida had not defeated him. Betrayal did. That distinction matters more than most history books have chosen to acknowledge. Consider what it would mean to live between two worlds, fully belonging to neither, yet somehow becoming the bridge that both needed. Quanah Parker was that bridge, and he built it entirely on his own terms. Born around 1845, Quanah was the son of Peta Nakona, a Comanche chief, and Cynthia Ann Parker, a white woman who had been captured by the Comanche as a child and raised among them. Her story was a complicated one. She had lived as Comanche, married Comanche, and loved her Comanche life even as the outside world called her captivity. Quanah grew up fully Comanche. He became one of the most feared and respected war leaders of the Quahadi Band, the last group of free Comanche who continued to resist confinement to the reservation system. For years, Quanah and his warriors conducted raids across the Texas Panhandle and into Mexico, living by the buffalo and the open range. But the buffalo were disappearing. Not naturally. The United States government had tacitly allowed and even encouraged mass slaughter of the herds, knowing that the Comanche's survival depended on them. Without the buffalo, resistance could not be sustained. Quanah surrendered in 1875. What happened next is one of the most remarkable stories of adaptation in American history. Quanah became a leader in a new sense. He built alliances with Texas ranchers, negotiated grazing rights, became wealthy, and traveled to Washington to advocate for his people. He practiced the Native American church openly and refused to abandon it despite pressure. He lived in a house called Star House and welcomed both worlds into it. He died in 1911, having lived a life that defied every category the outside world tried to place him in. Some people build bridges. Others become them. Imagine standing on a ridge at dawn and knowing with absolute clarity what will come next. Not with fear, with a kind of fierce, wide-open acceptance, the way a storm accepts the sky. Victorio of the Warm Springs Apache lived in that kind of clarity for the last years of his life. Born around 1825, Victorio, known to his people as Biduya, was a leader of the Cheyenne band of the Chiricahua Apache, a man whose connection to the land of the Ojo Caliente region in present-day New Mexico was not simply cultural. It was cellular. He believed, as his people did, that a human being torn from their homeland was not truly alive, only surviving. When the United States government repeatedly moved his people, breaking promises with the mechanical consistency of a machine, Victorio broke back. In 1879, he left the San Carlos Reservation with a small band and began what became known as Victorio's War, a campaign of raids and evasion across New Mexico, Texas, and northern Mexico that held two armies, one American and one Mexican, in a state of helpless frustration for more than a year. His knowledge of terrain was his greatest weapon. He used canyons, mountain passes, and desert silence the way a chess master uses position. He was never defeated in open battle. He was killed in October of 1880 at Tres Castillos in Chihuahua, Mexico, where a large Mexican force surrounded his camp. Most accounts say he died fighting. Some Apache oral histories say he took his own life rather than be captured. The distinction, in a way, is the same. He chose the ending. His sister, Lozan, a warrior and prophet in her own right, survived him and continued fighting alongside Geronimo. Some courage runs in families like water through stone. What if you were given one clear, honest look at the future, and the future told you to stop, not from cowardice, from wisdom, from the same intelligence that had made you nearly unbeatable? Little Turtle understood that moment, and he listened to it. Born around 1747, Little Turtle, or Michiganiqua, was a war chief of the Miami Nation in present-day Indiana and Ohio. He rose to prominence through a series of military engagements against American expansion into the Northwest Territory that stand among the most decisive Native American victories in history. In 1790, he led a coalition force that defeated General Josiah Harmar's army, killing more than 180 soldiers. The following year, in 1791, his forces inflicted the single greatest defeat ever suffered by the United States Army at the hands of Native Americans. At the Battle of the Wabash, also called St. Clair's Defeat, more than 600 American soldiers were killed. The American losses were greater than those at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. 600 soldiers. In a single engagement, Little Turtle then counselled peace. He told his allies that the Americans would send a general who did not sleep, referring to General Anthony Wayne, who was already being mobilized. He argued that another battle could not be won. His advice was rejected. The coalition fought Wayne at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794 and was decisively defeated. Little Turtle then negotiated the Treaty of Greenville in 1795 and spent his remaining years working for peaceful coexistence. He died in 1812, acknowledged even by his former enemies as a man of remarkable intellect. The ability to stop at the right moment requires more courage than many people ever find. Picture yourself walking through snow so deep it reaches your waist. Your children are wrapped in whatever cloth remains. Your food ran out days ago. Behind you is a military prison. Ahead of you is home, or what is left of it, and the distance between where you stand and where you belong has never felt longer or more necessary to cross. That walk was real. Dull Knife and his people took it. Born around 1810, Dull Knife, or Morning Star, known as Wohehiv in Cheyenne, was a principal chief of the Northern Cheyenne. He had been a leader during the conflicts of the 1860s and 70s and had fought in the Battle of the Little Bighorn alongside Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. After the defeat of the Northern Cheyenne resistance, Dull Knife's people were forcibly relocated to the hot malaria-ridden land of the Southern Cheyenne in Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma in 1877. They were people of the Northern Plains. The environment alone was killing them. In September of 1878, Dull Knife and another leader named Little Wolf led approximately 340 Northern Cheyenne, mostly women, children, and elderly, on a desperate trek northward toward their homeland, roughly 1,500 miles away. The United States Army pursued them with thousands of troops. They evaded, fought when necessary, and kept moving. Dull Knife's group was eventually captured and imprisoned at Fort Robinson in Nebraska. When the military threatened to send them back south, the prisoners broke out in a desperate flight in January of 1879. Many were killed. Dull Knife survived and eventually reached the Tongue River country, where the Northern Cheyenne were finally allowed to remain. He had walked home. Through everything. He had walked home. What if you were the largest man in the room, the most experienced, the most connected, and still none of that was enough to protect you from what was coming? Mangus Coloradus knew that helplessness, and he met it without flinching. Born around 1793, Mangus Coloradus, whose name means red sleeves in Spanish, was a principal chief of the Mimbreo Apache in what is now southwestern New Mexico. He stood well over 6 feet tall in an era when that was extraordinary, and his physical presence matched his political stature. He had bound together numerous Apache bands through strategic marriages and alliances, creating a network of relationships that made him the most influential Apache leader of his generation. For decades, he had navigated the brutal terrain of Apache relations with first Spain, then Mexico, then the United States, with diplomatic skill and measured force. He had fought when he had to, and negotiated when he could. After the Apache Pass conflict of 1861, Mangus Coloradus sought peace. He was old by then, his 60s, and had seen enough war to know what it cost. In January of 1863, he approached a military camp near Pinos Altos under a flag of truce to negotiate. He was taken prisoner, held through the night, and killed. Official military reports claimed he had tried to escape. Eyewitness accounts from soldiers told a different story entirely. He was subsequently beheaded, his skull sent east for phrenological study, which was the pseudo-scientific practice of measuring skulls to draw conclusions about intelligence and character. That final desecration was not incidental. It was a message. The response his people gave to that message continued for another 20 years of conflict in the mountains and deserts of the Southwest. Some acts of dishonor create consequences that outlast every calculation. Imagine being handed a prophecy, clear and specific, and knowing exactly what it means, not in a vague, interpretable way. Precisely, the way you know the difference between lightning in the distance and lightning directly above you. Roman Nose carried that knowledge with him into his final battle. Born around 1830, Roman Nose, or Wukanay, was a war leader of the Crooked Lance Society among the Northern Cheyenne. He was physically commanding, reputedly standing over 6 feet tall, with a presence in battle that drew both admiration and fear. He wore a powerful war bonnet created by a medicine man, and with it came strict spiritual rules. The bonnet's protective power depended on Roman Nose never eating food that had been touched by metal utensils. At the Battle of Beecher Island in September of 1868, on the Arikari Fork of the Republican River in present-day Colorado, Roman Nose prepared to lead a charge against a company of United States Army Scouts led by Colonel George Forsyth. His warriors had dug into a defensive position on a sandbar in the nearly dry river. Just before the charge, Roman Nose learned that he had unknowingly eaten food handled with a metal fork at a meal the previous evening. He knew what that meant. His medicine was broken. He was urged not to fight. He refused. He said his people were waiting for him to lead them. He rode to the front of the charge. He made several passes across the scouts' position. And then he was shot from his horse. He died later that evening. He had known what would happen. He rode forward anyway. That is not recklessness. That is a different kind of love. What if the world you had known your entire life was ending, not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, transaction by transaction, season by season, until one morning you woke up and realized that almost nothing recognizable remained. That is the world Metacom inherited. Known to English colonists as King Philip, Metacom was the son of Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader who had maintained decades of peace with the Plymouth colonists. Massasoit had believed cooperation was survival. By the time his son came to power in the 1660s, cooperation had mostly produced land loss, dependency, and a legal system that increasingly treated the Wampanoag not as sovereign people, but as subjects. In June of 1675, after years of mounting tension, war broke out. Metacom forged a coalition of multiple southern New England tribes, Wampanoag, Narragansett, Nipmuc, and others, and launched one of the most devastating military campaigns in the history of colonial America. At its peak, King Philip's War involved attacks on more than half of all English towns in New England. Dozens of settlements were burned. The war stretched over 14 months, and proportionally to the population of the time, it remains one of the deadliest conflicts in American history. The colonists ultimately prevailed through attrition, disease, starvation, and the defection of some native allies. Metacom was killed in August of 1676. He was beheaded, his body quartered, and his head displayed on a pike at Plymouth Colony for 25 years. His young son was sold into slavery in the Caribbean. The colonists called the war a victory. Metacom had called it a last defense. He was not wrong about what was at stake. He was simply outrun by forces too large for any single coalition to hold back. Suppose you stood at the edge of two rivers, one flowing toward peace and one toward war, and you had spent your entire life trying to build a dam between them, only to have that dam broken by forces entirely outside your control. Cornstalk built that dam, and it was broken in the cruelest way imaginable. Born around 1720 in present-day West Virginia, Cornstalk, or Hockalesqua, was a principal leader of the Shawnee Nation. He had earned respect as a warrior and a statesman across decades of navigating the increasingly dangerous borderland between native territories and colonial expansion in the Ohio Valley. At the Battle of Point Pleasant in October of 1774, Cornstalk led a large force of Shawnee against Virginia militiamen in one of the fiercest engagements of Lord Dunmore's war. The battle ended without a clear victor, but Cornstalk saw what was coming. He negotiated a peace agreement and became its most vocal advocate. He genuinely believed peace was the only path that did not lead to destruction. For years, he held his people back from joining the British alliance during the Revolutionary War, travelling repeatedly to American forts to counsel restraint and demonstrate his commitment to the agreement. In November of 1777, Cornstalk came to Fort Randolph to warn the Americans of growing pressure from pro-British factions and to demonstrate, once again, his peaceful intentions. He was taken hostage. When an American soldier was killed nearby, a mob of militiamen forced their way into the fort and murdered Cornstalk, his son Elenipsico, and two others. He had spent years building trust. He was killed for it. Those who keep faith in a faithless situation do not do so naively. They do so because they understand that someone has to. Consider what it would be like if you had seen the future clearly, tried everything in your power to prevent the worst of it, and watched it arrive anyway. What do you do with grief that large? Where do you put it? Lone Wolf of the Kiowa put it into resistance, one final and furious act of refusal. Born around 1820, Lone Wolf, or Guipago, was a principal chief of the Kiowa Nation whose territory spanned much of present-day Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. He had originally been willing to coexist with American expansion. He had even travelled to Washington in 1872, hoping that face-to-face conversation with the American government would produce real agreements. What he found in Washington were ceremonies and promises. What he found at home when he returned was a reservation system slowly tightening around everything his people had known. The breaking point came personally. In 1873, his son Tau Ankia and his nephew Guitain were killed by United States soldiers on a raid into Mexico. Lone Wolf retrieved their bodies and brought them home. He burned his son's possessions, as was Kiowa tradition. He cut his hair in mourning. And then he went to war. During the Red River War of 1874, Lone Wolf fought alongside other Southern Plains leaders in a final resistance to reservation confinement. The campaign ended in defeat. The Kiowa were forced onto the reservation at Fort Sill. Lone Wolf was sent to Fort Marion in Florida as a prisoner of war, where he was held for 3 years. He was released in 1879 and returned home broken in body, though witnesses said not in spirit. He died in 1879, shortly after his return, of malaria. He had asked only to keep what was his. The asking cost him everything. But the asking was not the mistake. The mistake was never his to own. Picture yourself standing before a room full of people who have already made up their minds about you, not because of what you have done, but because of what you represent. Every word you speak is filtered through their fear, their assumptions, their need to see you as something other than what you are. How do you make yourself heard in a room like that? Setanta of the Kiowa did not whisper. He roared. Born around 1830, Setanta, whose name means white bear, was one of the most eloquent and forceful voices the Kiowa nation ever produced. He was a warrior of remarkable skill, but it was his words that set him apart. He spoke with a clarity and passion that even his enemies acknowledged, and he understood that in the world being forced upon his people, language was becoming as necessary as any weapon. He attended the Medicine Lodge Treaty Council in 1867 and delivered a speech that stunned the assembled American commissioners. He said he loved the land and the buffalo and would not part with it. He said he wanted the children to grow up where their fathers had grown. The words were not diplomatic pleasantries. They were the full weight of a civilization pressing against the limits of a negotiating table. He was imprisoned twice. The second time, in 1874, he was sent to the Huntsville State Penitentiary in Texas following the Red River War. In 1878, learning he would never be released, Setanta threw himself from an upper window of the prison hospital. He had said, years before, that he would rather die on the open prairie than live in a house. He kept his word in the only way the prison walls allowed. Some voices cannot be contained. They simply find another way out. Think about what it means to witness something so enormous that no single word can hold it. Not a battle, exactly. More like a collision of worlds, loud and bright and final, and you are standing right in the middle of it, watching history crack open like the earth during a tremor. Two Moon was standing in the middle of it. Born around 1847, Two Moon was a chief of the Northern Cheyenne who became one of the key native leaders at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in June of 1876. He had come to the encampment on the Little Bighorn River after his own village was attacked and destroyed by Colonel Joseph Reynolds just months earlier, in March of 1876. His people had been living peacefully. The attack came without warning. He arrived at Sitting Bull's camp with what remained of his band, and when Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry attacked the massive encampment on June 25th, Two Moon was among the leaders who coordinated the devastating response. In later years, Two Moon gave interviews describing the battle in extraordinary detail. He described the soldiers falling like a tree that slowly topples, each branch going separately, first this one, then that one. His descriptions were poetic and precise, and carried the weight of a man who had seen something he could neither forget nor fully explain. After the battle, Two Moon eventually settled on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in Montana and became an important liaison between his people and the federal government, advocating persistently, if quietly, for Cheyenne rights. He died in 1917, one of the last surviving Cheyenne leaders who had fought at the Little Bighorn. He had watched a world change in a single afternoon. He spent the rest of his life explaining what he saw. Have you ever felt a grief so complete that it did not make you weak, but instead made you into something harder than you had ever been. Something focused and absolute, the way extreme heat transforms ordinary sand into glass. That is what happened to Gaul on the morning of June 25th, 1876. Born around 1840, Gaul or Pisi was a war leader of the Hunkpapa Lakota and one of Sitting Bull's most trusted commanders. He was already a formidable warrior before that day. What the morning of the Little Bighorn made him was something beyond formidable. When Major Marcus Reno's battalion attacked the southern end of the Lakota and Cheyenne encampment, soldiers killed 2 of Gaul's wives and 3 of his children in the opening moments of the assault. What followed was personal in a way that transcended military strategy. Gaul led the counterattack against Reno's forces with such ferocity that the soldiers were driven back across the Little Bighorn River and up the bluffs in a frantic retreat that became a rout. He then turned northward and hit Custer's command from the south and east, while Crazy Horse struck from the north and west. The battle lasted less than an hour. Gaul's tactical contribution was decisive. Military historians have studied his movements that day with a combination of professional admiration and something close to awe. After the wars, Gaul surrendered in 1881, settled on the Standing Rock Reservation, adopted farming, and became a judge on the Court of Indian Offences. He cooperated with the government, which confused many who had witnessed what he was capable of in battle. Perhaps he had simply decided that his people needed a different kind of warrior now. Grief, when it does not destroy you, has a way of clarifying exactly what matters. Imagine carrying a name that becomes a story before you even speak. A name that people whisper with a mixture of fear and fascination that grows larger than the person behind it, that accumulates legend the way a stone wall accumulates moss, layer by layer, until the original stone is barely visible. Rain in the Face lived inside a name like that. Born around 1835, Rain in the Face, or Iaheka T, was a Hunkpapa Lakota warrior whose reputation became one of the most mythologized in the history of the Plains Wars. He was said to have been involved in the deaths of several notable soldiers, and rumor connected him to the death of Captain Tom Custer, the younger brother of George Armstrong Custer, at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. Rain in the Face contributed to the mythology himself, giving different accounts of the battle at different times, sometimes confirming the stories, sometimes deflecting them. Whether he did this deliberately or simply found the legend useful is something historians still debate. What is clear is that he was a skilled and committed warrior who fought through the major engagements of the Sioux Wars. He was once arrested by Tom Custer himself, held at Fort Abraham Lincoln, and escaped, an act of defiance that deepened the animosity between them. He eventually surrendered and lived on the Standing Rock Reservation. He gave interviews late in life and was photographed and studied with the curious intensity that American culture directed at men it had both feared and defeated. He died in 1905. The legend had outgrown the man long before the end. But then, perhaps that is what legends are for, to carry the weight of what a single life cannot hold alone. What if you were the last one standing, not by choice, not by glory, but simply because the world around you had run out of road and you had not yet been willing to stop walking? Lemay Deer, or Taka Ushte, the elder, was something like that. A man at the end of a world, still refusing to accept it. Born around 1822, Lemay Deer was a chief of the Minneconjou Lakota and one of the leaders who did not surrender after the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. While many Lakota and Cheyenne leaders eventually came into the agencies through the brutal winter that followed, Lemay Deer kept his band moving, hunting, surviving in a landscape that was rapidly being closed around them. In May of 1877, General Nelson Miles located Lemay Deer's small camp on the Rosebud Creek in present-day Montana. What began as a potential surrender turned, in a matter of seconds, into tragedy. Accounts differ on exactly what happened. Lemay Deer had laid down his rifle in a gesture that appeared to signal surrender. Then, a shot was fired. possibly accidentally. Whether Lemdeer then raised his rifle again or was reaching for something else is a question that was never fully resolved. The soldiers opened fire. Lemdeer and his nephew were killed. He had kept his people free longer than almost anyone. He had chosen open ground over the suffocation of the reservation for as long as the ground remained open. That choice, in the end, cost him everything. But consider this. He knew what the reservation meant. He had watched others go. He chose the cold and the hunger and the chase over that. Some people define freedom not by what it gives them, but by what they refuse to trade it for. Think about what happens when every peaceful option has been tried and failed. When you have watched the agreements dissolve, the land shrink, the resources vanish, and the people around you respond to injustice with patience, while the injustice continues uninterrupted. What does a person do with that accumulation? Inkpaduta answered that question in a way that terrified an entire frontier. Born around 1800, Inkpaduta, meaning Scarlet Point, was a leader of a band of Wapakut Dakota Sioux who had been effectively pushed to the margins of his own society. He had been declared an outlaw by some Dakota leaders for previous acts of violence, meaning he operated outside the tribal structures that had attempted, with varying success, to maintain peace with encroaching American settlers. In March of 1857, Inkpaduta and his band attacked a series of settler communities along the shores of Spirit Lake in present-day Iowa, killing approximately 40 people. The attacks were brutal, and they shocked the American frontier. He was never captured. He evaded pursuit with a skill that frustrated military commanders for years. He was reported to have fought at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, making him one of the few leaders connected to both the Spirit Lake Massacre and the defeat of Custer, nearly 20 years apart. He died in Canada around 1880, beyond the reach of American law. History has tended to frame Inkpaduta as simply violent, but the desperation that produced him was not random. It was the specific product of a system that had removed every other option with deliberate consistency. That does not simplify what happened. But understanding the roots of a fire is not the same as excusing it. It is simply how we learn to prevent the next one. Close your eyes and picture a vision spreading across a people like light moving across water. Not through newspapers or declarations, but through whispered conversations, through ceremony, through the desperate human need to believe that what has been lost can somehow be restored. Kicking Bear carried that vision from its source directly to the people who needed it most. Born around 1846, Kicking Bear was an Oglala Lakota warrior who had fought in the major conflicts of the Plains Wars, including the Battle of the Little Bighorn. But it is what he did in 1890 that marked him most deeply in history. He travelled to Nevada to visit Wovoka, the Paiute holy man, who had received a powerful vision during a solar eclipse in 1889. In that vision, Wovoka saw the return of the old world. The buffalo would come back, the ancestors would return, the earth would be renewed, and those who performed the ghost dance, a ceremonial circle dance, would be protected and carried into that new world. Kicking Bear brought the ghost dance back to the Lakota reservations. He added an element that Wovoka had not included. He told the Lakota that special ghost dance shirts would make the wearers impervious to bullets. The ghost dance spread with extraordinary speed across the reservations. To the Lakota, suffering through drought, starvation, and the grief of everything lost, it was not superstition. It was oxygen. To American authorities, it was terrifying. The military mobilization that followed led directly to the killing of Sitting Bull and the massacre at Wounded Knee. Kicking Bear surrendered in January of 1891. He had brought his people a dream. The dream was real. The bullets, sadly, were also real. Envision yourself leading a group of sick and freezing people through winter snow, not toward victory, but simply toward something you hope might be called safety. The temperature drops below 0 at night. Several of the people with you are already dying, and the soldiers tracking you are not far behind. That was the last journey of Bigfoot. Born around 1825, Bigfoot, or Tecumseh, also known as Spotted Elk, was a chief of the Miniconjou Lakota known for his skill in negotiation and his ability to resolve disputes peacefully. He had a reputation as a peacemaker, which makes what happened to him one of history's quieter, more devastating ironies. After the killing of Sitting Bull in December of 1890, terrified Lakota fled the Standing Rock Reservation. Bigfoot's band of approximately 350 people, mostly women, children, and elderly, began moving toward the Pine Ridge Reservation, hoping to find safety with Red Cloud. Bigfoot himself was suffering from severe pneumonia. He rode in a wagon, bleeding from the nose, wrapped in blankets against the cold. On December 28, 1890, his band was intercepted by the 7th Cavalry and escorted to Wounded Knee Creek. The following morning, as soldiers attempted to disarm the Lakota, a shot was fired. What happened next was not a battle. It was a massacre. More than 250 Lakota men, women, and children were killed. Bigfoot was among the first to die. His frozen body was photographed in the snow, and that image became one of the most haunting documents of the era. He had asked only for safe passage. He had asked for the most ordinary thing imaginable. What would it feel like to lead people through a narrow mountain pass at night, in silence, knowing that one wrong sound, one stumble, one crying child could bring everything down around you? Whitebird knew exactly what that felt like. Born around 1807, Whitebird, or Peopiohihi, was a chief of the Whitebird Band of the Nez Perce, and one of the senior leaders who joined Chief Joseph's remarkable retreat of 1877. He was already elderly by the time the flight began, a man in his 70s moving through some of the most demanding terrain in North America. He was not simply surviving, however. He was fighting. At the opening engagement of the Nez Perce War, the Battle of Whitebird Canyon on June 17, 1877, it was Whitebird's band that faced the initial cavalry assault. His warriors, though outnumbered, used the terrain of the canyon with such precision that they killed 34 soldiers without losing a single man. It remains one of the most tactically perfect defensive engagements in the history of the conflicts. When Chief Joseph made his surrender speech in October of 1877 at the Bear Paw Mountains, Whitebird was not with him. In the darkness following the final battle, he led a group of men, women and children through a gap in the military cordon and continued north. They reached Canada. Whitebird lived among the Lakota in Canada for years. He was killed around 1882 in a personal dispute. He never returned to Nez Perce land. He had escaped the cage, but the homeland was still gone. Sometimes freedom and belonging are not the same country, and a person is left to choose which one they can live without. Picture yourself being given a role you did not seek, in a crisis you did not start, and then being blamed for the outcome of decisions made in a chaos too large for any single person to control. That was Looking Glass at the end. Born around 1832, Looking Glass, or Alalimia Takanin, was a chief of a Nez Perce band that lived along the Clearwater River. He had initially tried to stay out of the conflict of 1877 entirely. His village was peaceful. He had declared neutrality. Then, United States soldiers attacked his village anyway in July of 1877, burning it and scattering his people. That attack pushed him directly into the conflict and directly into a leadership role he had not asked for. He became one of the primary military strategists during the long retreat, and for much of the journey he counselled delay, believing the Nez Perce could negotiate from a position of temporary safety. He led the group on a longer, slower path through Yellowstone, convinced that a less hurried approach would allow for diplomacy. Many historians believe that delay cost the Nez Perce the time they needed to reach Canada. When General Miles finally surrounded the Nez Perce at the Bear Paw Mountains, Looking Glass urged the people not to surrender, insisting that Sitting Bull's Lakota would come from Canada to help them. He was scanning the horizon for those riders when a single bullet struck him in the forehead on October 5th, 1877. He died looking toward the help that did not arrive. It is one of the saddest images in the history of that terrible journey. A man watching the horizon, still believing, right up until the moment he no longer could. Have you ever been in a situation where you fought not because you believed you could win, but because there was simply nothing left to lose, where every door had closed and the one you were standing in front of had been locked from the outside? Captain Jack stood in that doorway. Born around 1837, Captain Jack, or Kinpuash, was the leader of a band of Modoc people from the volcanic lakelands of present-day Northern California and Southern Oregon. He had a complicated relationship with accommodation and resistance, trying for years to find a workable arrangement with American authorities. The central conflict was simple and brutal. The Modoc wanted to live on their ancestral land around Lost River. The government wanted them on a shared reservation with the Klamath, a rival tribe, where they were treated as unwelcome guests. The situation was untenable, and everyone knew it. War broke out in 1872 when soldiers attempted to forcibly return Captain Jack's band to the reservation. What followed was the Modoc War, in which a band of approximately 50 to 60 Modoc warriors sheltering in the jagged lava beds south of Tule Lake held off a United States Army force that eventually numbered over 1,000 men for nearly 6 months. The lava beds, a landscape of razor-sharp rock and natural fortifications, were a natural fortress that Captain Jack understood completely. He was eventually betrayed by members of his own band who surrendered and testified against him. Captain Jack was tried and hanged on October 3rd, 1873. He had asked to go home. For the entirety of the conflict, that was all he had asked. It is worth sitting with that fact. The whole terrible story began with one man wanting to live where he belonged. Think about what it means to be asked to disappear quietly, not to die, necessarily, but to step back from everything you have known, to fold yourself into a smaller shape, and to stop taking up space that others have decided belongs to them now. Colorado refused to fold. Born around 1810, Colorado was a leader among the Ute people of present-day Colorado, a man whose personality defied the neat categories that American authorities tried to impose on native leaders. He was described by those who interacted with him as stubborn, theatrical, and relentlessly difficult to manage, which was, depending on your perspective, either a serious problem or a profound act of self-preservation. He had grown up in a time when the Ute controlled vast territories across Colorado and Utah. He had watched that territory shrink through the 1860s and 70s as silver and gold drew miners into Ute lands with an appetite that no treaty could fully satisfy. In 1879, the Meeker Massacre, in which Ute warriors killed Indian agent Nathan Meeker and several employees at the White River Agency during a crisis that Meeker himself had largely provoked, gave American authorities the justification they needed to remove the Ute from Colorado, almost entirely. Colorado resisted relocation with persistent, grinding resistance rather than open warfare. He kept returning to Colorado from the Utah reservation, crossing the boundary again and again, hunting in the familiar mountains, refusing to accept that the line drawn on a map superseded a lifetime of belonging. In 1887, a confrontation near the Colorado border became known as Colorado's War, a brief, almost symbolic conflict that ended without major bloodshed. He died in 1888. He had simply kept showing up. Sometimes that is the most radical thing a person can do. Imagine spending your life trying to hold two realities together at the same time. In one hand, the world as it was, the open land, the old ceremonies, the buffalo-centered life. In the other hand, the world as it was becoming, the fences, the agencies, the classrooms. And your entire purpose is to make sure your people survive the crossing from one to the other without losing everything that makes them who they are. Hollow Horn Bear carried both. Born around 1850, Hollow Horn Bear, or Himaza, was a Brule Lakota chief who had fought in the conflicts of the 1860s and 70s, riding with war parties and participating in engagements against United States forces. He was a warrior first, and a skilled one. But he was also a man who understood that the world was changing in ways that could not be reversed by any battle. After the end of the major conflicts, Hollow Horn Bear became a prominent voice for his people in the reservation era. He traveled to Washington multiple times to negotiate on behalf of the Lakota. He rode in the inaugural parades of both President Theodore Roosevelt in 1905 and President Woodrow Wilson in 1913, representing his people with a dignity and presence that those crowds had not expected. He was photographed extensively and became one of the most recognizable Native American faces of his era. His image was used on a 14-cent United States postage stamp in 1922, and some historians have suggested his profile influenced early designs of what became the Indian head nickel. He died in 1913 in Washington of pneumonia contracted during Wilson's inaugural events. He had ridden in parades for a nation that was still deciding whether his people had a place in it. He showed up anyway. Picture yourself at a council meeting where the elders around you are preparing to sign something away. The decision has been made, the arguments have been heard, and the atmosphere carries the exhausted weight of people who believe they have run out of choices. Then one voice rises and says, "No." That voice belonged to Dragging Canoe. Born around 1738, Dragging Canoe, or Tsiugunsini, was a war chief of the Chickamauga Cherokee, and he became one of the longest-lasting and most determined resistors of European colonial expansion in the American Southeast. At the signing of the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals in 1775, when Cherokee leaders agreed to sell a vast tract of land to the Transylvania Company, Dragging Canoe stood and spoke against it. He warned that the Cherokee were giving away the hunting grounds that sustained them and would receive in return a chain that would eventually bind every part of their lives. He was not listened to. He left the council and formed his own group, the Chickamaugans, and for the next 2 decades conducted one of the most persistent resistance campaigns in the history of the colonial frontier. He allied with the British during the American Revolution, then continued fighting after the revolution ended, because for him, the war was not about British or American politics, it was about land. He outlasted the revolution. He outlasted the alliances. He kept fighting. He died in 1792, reportedly of illness following a celebration of a military victory. He died celebrating. He had been warning people about what was coming since 1775. He had been right about all of it, and he had never once pretended otherwise. Let us close with the ones whose names we do not know. History has a way of preserving the voices that were already loud. The leaders, the chiefs, the men who sat across tables from generals and commissioners, but for every name we have spoken in this series, there are 100 names that were never written down, never recorded, never carried forward. Think for a moment about what it would feel like to have lived a life of enormous courage and left no trace that the world could find, to have protected your family through a brutal winter, to have ridden into a valley where the odds were impossible, to have sung your songs and raised your children and held your ground, and then to have simply disappeared from the record, absorbed back into the silence from which history says you came. The forgotten warriors of Native America were not footnotes. They were the foundation. They were the women who moved camps in the dark, the young men who rode as scouts and never came back, the elders who kept the oral traditions alive when everything else was being taken, the children who survived and carried memories inside them like seeds in dry ground, waiting for rain. Every great leader we have named in this series stood on the shoulders of people whose names are lost. Crazy Horse did not ride alone. Geronimo did not strategize alone. Chief Joseph did not walk alone. The forgotten warriors walked beside them, and behind them, and sometimes in front of them, clearing the path. Why do we tend to forget them? Perhaps because heroism that comes without a name challenges us to think differently about what heroism actually is. It is not the name that makes the courage. It is the choice, made in the dark, to keep going anyway. The forgotten warriors made that choice 10,000 times, and we are still, in some quiet way, living inside the space they held.